Hey peeps, it's James Buckle of Engage Pixel here. This is part 2 of my Gamemaker tutorial for creating destructible terrain. And in this part I'm going to extend the previous tutorial where I just created a single terrain object, and I'm going to create multiple terrain objects that transfer damage next to each other and has a custom hole and just sort of generally improves upon the previous version. So the first bit of polish I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to create a custom sprite hole. Instead of just a circle, what if you want to use a sprite to punch the hole in the terrain? So for that I've created this little sprite, 32 by 32. It's just a bit of a mess, just with a pen, just, and again using a pure black colour. So I'm going to return to Object Terrain and the Draw Begin event. And if you go to the line where the Draw Circle line, where you draw the circle against that to punch the damage hole, we want to replace this line with the sprite and draw the sprite instead. So we just go Draw Sprite. Let's try actually putting that on the right line. Here we go, Draw Sprite. SPR hole. It's going to be subimage 0 because there's only one subimage and that's the one we're using. If you wanted to be fancy here, you could have a whole bunch of different hole shapes, and you could randomize the use iRandom to pick a different image, and then it would just create lots of different weird shaped holes. But I'm just using the one, and I'm going to put damage X and damage Y. So the sprite, which was created earlier, will be drawn as the for the damage hole. So if I save that and run it, if I now click on the sprite, we'll see it creates a wiggly hole for the damage. So the next thing I'm going to do is go into the room and add a bunch of these, because I want to do damage to multiple terrain objects, because you need to make a level out of loads of these. So I'm going to run this and we'll see what happens. So what happens with the current version of this terrain object when I click on it? Well, something that's not supposed to happen. This appears to be working, but all the others are gone, which means there's a bug somewhere and I'm going to have to go and find it. Now, when I put this tutorial together, it took me a while to figure out what I'd missed and what was going on here. And the answer I realised was, the first time you create a new sprite and you delete the old sprite, well, all the terrain objects are sharing the same initial sprite. They all start with the same reference to the original sprite, and then create their own individual sprites as they take damage. So when I do delete old sprite the first time, I'm actually deleting the original sprite that they were using, which is a problem, because then any other object using it that hasn't had damage and created its own sprite yet can't now create a new sprite. So what I need to do is do a little catch in here to only delete the sprite if it's not the original sprite. So what I'm going to do is go into the create event, and we're going to create another boolean flag. This one will be delete sprite. Can't spell delete today. Delete sprite, there we go. And we're going to start it out false. Then going to go back to the draw event here, and just here we'll say if delete sprite, and we'll put this inside the if. So now we have sprite delete inside the if. So So the first time you come through, it's going to sprite delete will be set to false. You'll create the new sprite, but you won't delete the old one because sprite delete is false. But if sprite delete is false, then second time around you're going to need it to be true so that it will delete it. So in here, we make sprite delete, or we make delete sprite true equals true. So the first time round it's false, gets set to true. Second time round, it will delete the sprite. This way, it's not going to delete the original sprite, and it should hopefully work. So I'll run it and see. Okay, here we go. Yep, it works. I can click on them all. What happens when I click? Oh, oh. Now there's a couple of strange things going on here. The first problem is that if you click where the join is, it's only damaging the one you click on and not damaging the one next to it. So I need to have damage get shared across the neighbours. The other problem is there's a weird bug here where damage holes are well, disappearing or shrinking, or yeah, and that's just plain weird. Now, when I was putting this tutorial together, I spent quite some time trying to figure out why this bug was happening. And the long and the short of it is, I have no idea. But I do have a solution. I'm able to fix this bug, I just don't know how the bug occurs. Which is a little bit frustrating because, you know, you want to know why bugs occur so that you can avoid them in the future. But since I have a solution, it's not that big a deal. Now the solution is to actually store each click in an array. So essentially each object has a little array that saves each damage point, and when you redraw the sprite, you redraw every single instance of damage. It's a little bit more work, especially if there's a lot of damage done to a sprite, but it means you don't have this weird thing with stuff disappearing. So let's show you how to do that. Okay, so if I close the debugger, return to object terrain, I'm going to go into the create event, and the first thing I need to do is create a couple of lists to store the X and Y locations. So I'll just be lock X equals ds list create, and lock Y equals ds list create. There we go. So I've got a couple of lists. What I then need to do is, on the left pressed, when we store, when you take damage and you press and you click on it, instead of just putting it in the single damage variable here, this now needs to go into the lists. So I do ds list add lock X, and that'll take mx, and then ds list add lock Y my. So now if I get rid of that, damage is recorded in this list. Then when I draw the sprite here, I need to place this draw sprite line inside a for loop that loops through the lists and uses them as, and draws each instance of damage each time the sprite gets clicked on. So for h equals 0, h is less than ds list size lock X, could use lock X, could use lock Y, doesn't really matter, they're both going to be the same size, and h++. So that's our loop created. We put our draw sprite stuff in the loop. Oops. There we go. The other thing I need to do is change these to lock X, and I'm going to use the accessor, which is this little vertical line. So lock X H and lock YH underscore H. There we go. So now it's going to loop through these lists. I didn't spell size right. There we go. It's going to loop through each of these lists and redraw every single point of damage it takes each time it draws a sprite. That way it should correct for whatever the bug is. So I'm not actually fixing the bug, but rather this is a workaround. It's going to redraw everything correctly so that it undoes whatever damage it is that's being done to it, so to speak. So I'm going to run this and check that it works. Okay, so this time if I keep clicking on these, we should see, yep, no shrinking, disappearing holes, they're all staying there and everything's great. So although it's not as efficient as it was previously because it's now doing a lot more drawing, it doesn't create the holes. Next problem, of course, is making it damage its neighbour. Now, there's a few different ways of doing this that I tried before I ended up with the version that I'm going to show you now. And I went with this one not because it's necessarily the most efficient or best, but rather because the other versions were a bit buggy and had weird behaviours. The final version works, and works great and does exactly what it's supposed to without any odd not drawing them correctly in the right things. Like there was an odd bug where depending on what order you place the object terrain objects in the room, it would then not draw it properly unless you then reordered them in the room, which made no sense at all and shouldn't have affected anything. But yeah, I'm not sure what was going on there, but I've developed a way of doing this that works, so we're going to do that. Even though it's not exactly the best way of doing it, it's the way of doing it that works. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is pop over to the create event in your object terrain, and I need to determine I need to create a distance variable, which I'm going to call neighbor range, which is essentially how far away are the neighbours. Now if I look at room 1 again, we can see here, here's an object, here's an object, here's an object. Now their XY is the top corner, and this guy to that guy is 128 pixels. Likewise, from that top corner to this guy's top corner is 128 pixels. But this guy to this guy is more than that. Now that diagonal, if you remember your trig from school, is the square on the hypotenuse. It's the Pythagoras theorem. Pythagoras? Yeah. The square on the hypotenuse is the sum of the square of the other two sides. So we need to use that to figure out... Now, I mean, I could guess and manually just put a number in, because essentially this guy who'll be out of range will be 256 away from this guy, and that'll be the nearest next person, whereas this guy will be somewhere more than 128 but somewhere less than 256. So if I just make the neighbour range 200, that should work. But at the same time, if I change the size of these squares, I don't want to be manually changing that. So I want to on create just figure out what the distance is, do it in code kind of thing instead of just manually putting a number in, because it's a trivial little bit of maths. So what we need to do is find the square of the side, and the square of the side is just sprite height times sprite height. Both sides are the same, it's the same number, so that's the square of the side. The square of the hypotenuse is that twice. So that's, well, effectively the sum of the square sides, because I've just doubled it. So now what we need to do is find the square root of that and put it in neighbour range, which is the squirt function for square root. Square root of sh. Now I want it to be an integer, so I'm actually going to go over here and use the ceil function to round it upwards. It's the ceiling. There's two functions for rounding up and down to the nearest integer, which is ceil and floor, for ceiling and floor. But just for an extra bit of fuzzy, and I'm just going to add 2 to it, just to make sure everything fits. So that's giving me the neighbour range distance check value. Now I actually have to do a bit of distance checking for the neighbour. Now I'm going to go back to this left pressed here, the left pressed event, and in here check for neighbour. So what this will do, I'll start by doing with obj terrain. Now what this does is it loops through every single instance of obj terrain in the current room and executes this piece of code that I put in here for each one. And because I don't want it to do it with the current one, because I've already logged its damage up there, I'm going to start by making sure it's not the clicked on obj terrain by saying if other does not equal ID. Other is a context sensitive keyword that basically says what the other thing was. So, and it, depending on where you're using it, what the other thing was changes. It can, outside of any context where other makes sense, if you just use it, so outside of this, rather inside this with loop, because I've transferred the focus of the script to a different object, other is referring to the object that's calling it. But in this piece of code, if I used other, it would refer to itself and just loop back to itself. But in here, the other keyword is saying, okay, what the other thing was that you were using just now, which is the clicked on terrain, and obj ID is the ID of the current obj terrain that is within this if loop. If they're the same, if these are the same, then you've already logged the damage because it's the clicked on one, and I don't need to click and I don't need to do the damage again. So now I know that it's not the one I've already clicked on, and it is actually one that the other obj terrain objects. I want to do a distance check to make sure it's not actually, or to make sure it's in range. So I'm going to use file dist, and I'm going to use the point distance function, and it's this object's xy to the other object's xy. So now file dist holds the distance away, and I want to say if the distance away is less than the neighbor range, then it's in range, which means this object I'm currently dealing with is one of the neighboring objects. So then what I need to do is figure out if the mouse click was actually next to it, because I don't want to if we go back to room 1 a second. Here's this object's next to it, so is this object. If I'm clicking here, then that's likely to damage that one as well, but it's not likely to damage that one. So what I need to do is use the bounding box, or this thing's position in the world, extend it out slightly and say, is the mouse actually clicking somewhere in the vicinity around the border of this neighbouring object? So I've clicked on this object. Is this object actually close enough to this mouse click that it's worth damaging it? Because I don't want this one doing damage. So if I click in this top corner here, this one's next to it, it's probably damaged that, so I need to get that, but these two are far enough away that it's not going to actually damage them, so it doesn't need to get logged for damage. So to do that, I'm going to use the point in rectangle against the mouse coordinates to determine if they are near to this object. Now I'm going to use the objects XY, but I also need to do the other corner XY. I could use the bounding box variables, but I'm not sure how they're going to actually... the bounding box will change when the collision mask changes and it takes damage. So if it ends up with a bunch of damage somewhere, that could distort the bounding box values, so you won't actually... You might well click and do damage and not get it or something. So I'm not going to use the bounding box because of the potential for the change in collision mask. I'm actually going to... And it's trivial to actually set up the two values that I need. It's so the other corner, I'll call it var cx, and it's x plus sprite width, and var cy equals y plus sprite, if I can spell that correctly, sprite height. So now x and y are in the top left corner, cx and cy, underscore cx and underscore cy at the bottom right corner. What I then need is a little buffer, and I'll make that 32 to begin with, because I'm going to actually add this to extend and essentially slightly inflate the rectangle that I'm checking against to see if I'm clicking next to this object. So I'm going to say if point in rectangle mouse x mouse y, and then x minus mbuff, y minus mbuff, cx plus mbuff, cy plus mbuff. Donk, donk. Okay, what have I done wrong? It's throwing an error. Not enough brackets. There we go. Yep. So now what I've done is I've said, okay, the mouse was clicked in the vicinity of this object. It's probably taken damage, so let's log the location as somewhere to draw damage. Just as with the damage up here, I need to essentially replicate these values, but do them relative to this object. So I'm going to create a var ox equals mouse x minus x, var oy equals mouse y minus y. So that's the damage location. ds list add lock x comma ox, ds list add lock y comma oy. So that's logged the damage location relative to its sprite, and then I make hit equal true, which will then on the next pass of the draw event trigger it to draw its damage. So now this time, if I run this, hopefully it'll do damage all over the place and it'll transfer damage across to its neighbours. And there we go. Creating lots of holes all over the place, and the points where they overlap, or where one is neighbouring the other. Ding 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 ding. We have lots of lovely little holes. Isn't that great? So that's that for part 2. If you come back for part 3, I'll be doing a few extra bits and just sort of polishing it up and making it pretty.